Hi, I'm Warren Berger. I'm the owner of Luminary Financial Advisors. And today I wanted to talk about a question that I often get from new clients, and that's how much can I spend in retirement? And I usually come back with, I think we're asking the wrong question. So I want to talk a little bit about that today and some potential solutions. But before we get rolling, my attorneys always want me to just let everybody know that this is not investment or legal advice. And that, if you take anything away from here, it's always best to run it by your own CPA, your attorney, or your financial advisor. But hopefully you can get some good information. So back to the question at hand, and I guess you would want to ask me, well, what is the question that I should be asking? And we should first start off with, well, what are your goals? What are we going to be spending money on in retirement? Because just picking a number out of the air and saying, hey, we want to spend all of this money doesn't take into consideration the fact that one, we want to have flexibility in our spending, and we want to be able to spend a little less when markets aren't doing so great, and maybe spend little bit more when they're doing well. We want to make sure that all of the necessary spending, like healthcare, housing, is going to be covered. And then, for some of you, you might want to be leaving a legacy for children or grandchildren. So everyone's situation is going to be a little bit different. But we start out by framing, what are the goals? What are these bucket list items, these things that you've been wanting to do all these years that you're finally able to start to look at? And so we frame that in a way of saying, hey, there are the necessary things, like I just talked about, healthcare, housing, things like that. So where are the steady streams of income available to cover those sort of really necessary items? And that can come from pensions. It can come from Social Security, which is really a big one for most people, or annuities. And there's all different kinds of insurance products that are out there that can get you there. But the idea is figure out what these steady income streams are and apply that to the really necessary items. And then when we get into our investments, like a 401k or IRA, or 403b, whatever it is that you may have in place, we're really looking to apply that to any gaps that we see in that necessary spending. So if your steady stream of income doesn't quite cover that, then we want to make sure that we're going to be taking care of that first. And then the discretionary items, these fun bucket lists, hobbies, things like that, we start to figure out what it is that we'd like to be doing with those things and how much that's potentially going to cost. And once we have an idea of what that is, we do now. Different people have different ways of looking at this. So in the past, you may have heard of the 4% rule, and that came about from a study done in 1994 that looked at the 30 worst years in the markets, and they basically established that if you were to spend 4% of your invested assets over a 30-year period, you could do that without running out of money, and so it became sort of a rule of thumb. There's a couple of problems with that. One is, and I think the biggest one is longevity risk. So, you might live longer than 30 years in retirement. And this study was done based on someone retiring at 65, and that at this time in 1994, it was improbable that they would live past 95. But it doesn't take into consideration someone that retires at 62 or somebody that lives to 98. It also doesn't take into consideration the fact that your spouse may be 5 or 6 years younger than you or more. And so we really have to plan not only just for you, but for potentially the younger spouse. So to me, it doesn't have that degree of flexibility, but we do have to start somewhere. And so for some of you, the 4% rule might make sense as a starting place if you're going to put in some of these flexible mechanisms that I'm going to talk about. For us at our firm, we use what's called Monte Carlo analysis. And essentially what that is we look at 1,000 different statistical probabilities of what can happen based on what we think that your spending is going to be and assumptions of what we're going to get from returns in the market and what we think inflation is going to be over time. We don't have a crystal ball for this. When it comes to planning the future, I don't think any of us has a real take on exactly what that's going to be. But we can take the best information that we have. We can start on a path and then make critical, constant adjustments as we move. And that's where I keep bringing up this term flexibility, because the more flexible your plan is, the more able you're going to be able to withstand some of the barriers and troubles. We're sitting here in 2022 right now. We have some really challenging markets ahead of us. And if you're in a situation where you are flexible in how you can spend, you're going to be able to withstand this a lot better. And so over a 30 to 40 year retirement, we might run into 2 or 3 or even more bear markets. And so if you're nimble in how your retirement income is planned, you're going to be a lot better off. So, how do we do that? First, we start off with a number, right? And I said we use Monte Carlo. You may use 4% or whatever percentage you use. But what we like to try to do is put in income guardrails. So that means that we are going to adjust spending, and we look at that every year based on what the market's done. So, for instance, we're sitting here in 2022. Let's just say we finished the year and the markets ended negative. Well, the cost of living increases that we would normally give to ourselves for inflation, which we generally have priced in at 3% because that's the average over the last 40 years. If the market is negative, just in that given year, we won't take a cost of living increase. We won't take that. We won't take that 3% raise that we give ourselves each year. We just take a break from it. Almost imperceptible in your budget, but it does go a long way in preserving over a 30 or 40 year period the funds that you have in place. Secondly, we put these guardrails, top and bottom guardrails in place. So let's just say that you started out with, for argument's sake, 5% of your assets that you're taking out, and the markets perform poorly. In our case, if we start to see that 5% creep up by 20%, say, for instance, it's now that, say we start out with $50,000, and that creeps up to now 6% rather than 5% because the markets went down and you have less assets, then we're going to take a 10% decrease in our spending. So it's basically as if you were in the workforce before you retired and there's downsizing at your company and you got a salary decrease or something like that, you're likely going to decrease your spending. And we're going to do the same thing in retirement. So in this case, we're going to decrease it by 10%. Conversely, if the markets do really well, and now we see that the percentage that we started out with has decreased by 20% of the total, then we're gonna give you a 10% raise, basically, 10% increase in your spending to account for the fact that markets have done that much better. And so we can do that every year. And I'll give you a real example of this in real life. And I've been using that $50,000 number, but let's just say that you had $1 million worth of assets. And we went through a process and we decided that the initial spending was going to be $50,000. Now, whether you said you wanted it, which happens to be 5%, depending on how you arrived at that, did you want to start with 5% or was it from a Monte Carlo analysis? But we're just going to go on the assumption that we're starting at 5%, $50,000. If the market went down to $833,000, that would mean that you are now taking, rather than 5%, it's now 6%. That same $50,000 is now 60% of the now lower $833,000. In that case, we're going to take a 10% reduction in our spending over the next year, and it could be more if we have multiple years of a downturn, but we're going to take that 10% reduction just to make sure that we're staying on course with our overall plan. Now, conversely, in an up market, in this case, $1 million, and we're taking $50,000 a year as our starting amount of income, and the markets went up to $1.25 million, well, now that $50,000 would represent just 4% of what your assets are. And so in that case, we can take a raise. We can actually take 10% and add that to your spending. So we're constantly and dynamically adjusting to how markets are performing. And this way, if we have these down markets, you don't have to find yourself sweating that, hey, my nest egg is dwindling away, because we are being proactive. We're taking care of what needs to be taken care of to make this last for 30, 40, or even longer. And we're going to assess this every year. So, each year as we're moving towards that goal of reaching the end of our plan with money, ultimately, a successful retirement isn't based on the idea of how much can I spend in retirement, but more importantly, what are your goals and how flexible of a plan can you build to make sure that you're navigating your way through the 30 to 40 years that you might be doing this retirement. Check out my video on bucketing strategy as well. That's going to give you a little bit of insight into where you want to put your money in order to get the most successful retirement. It's right on our channel, and hopefully it's something that you can use. But in the meantime, thank you for listening and watching, and I hope to see you again on one of my other videos.